The door everyone avoided was the one that needed kindness the most. Claire Bennett adjusted the strap of her leather satchel as the first rays of morning sunlight spilled across the stone courtyard of the Royal Infirmary. It was her very first day serving as an Omega healer inside Blackwood Keep, and although excitement fluttered inside her heart, she carried herself with quiet confidence learned through years of caring for injured travelers, elderly villagers, and frightened children who simply needed someone willing to listen. The infirmary was already awake. Shelves filled with dried herbs lined the walls, copper kettles released fragrant steam into the crisp morning air, and experienced healers hurried between treatment rooms carrying clean bandages and fresh herbal mixtures. Claire greeted everyone with a warm smile before receiving a quick tour from one of the senior assistants. They passed bright recovery rooms where patients chatted peacefully, treatment tables neatly arranged with polished instruments, and sunny windows overlooking the palace gardens. Everything felt welcoming until an urgent call echoed from the front entrance. Several healers immediately rushed toward newly arriving patients, leaving Claire standing alone at the end of a long hallway she had never seen before. She waited politely, expecting someone to return with further instructions, but the busy corridors remained filled with hurried footsteps and quiet voices. At the very end of the hallway stood a single wooden door slightly separated from the others. Unlike every nearby room, no visitors entered or left. No flowers decorated the windowsill. No conversations drifted beneath the doorway. Only silence remained. Claire hesitated for a brief moment before gently knocking. Receiving no answer, she carefully opened the door and stepped inside. Soft morning light filtered through narrow windows, illuminating a private room far simpler than she expected. A tall man rested quietly upon the bed, his dark hair falling loosely across the pillow while neatly wrapped bandages covered one shoulder beneath a plain linen shirt. Although fatigue rested upon his face, his posture remained composed, almost dignified. When he noticed the unfamiliar healer entering, calm silver eyes slowly opened and met hers with quiet curiosity rather than suspicion. Claire offered a reassuring smile. "Good morning. My name is Claire. I am new here, and it looks like you have not had company for a while." The man studied her gently before answering in a calm voice. "Perhaps everyone else already knows something you do not." Claire glanced around the peaceful room, noticing a pitcher of fresh water that had not been touched, a tray of untouched breakfast, and several bottles of herbal medicine arranged neatly beside the bed. "All I know," she replied kindly, "is that someone should check how you are feeling." A faint smile appeared across the stranger's face. "Most people begin with questions." Claire set her satchel upon a nearby chair and washed her hands before preparing fresh bandages. "Healing begins before questions," she answered softly. She carefully examined the dressing with practiced hands, replacing it with clean linen and applying a soothing herbal ointment whose gentle scent filled the quiet room. The mysterious patient never complained or interrupted. Instead, he watched her work with thoughtful attention, almost as though every small gesture carried unexpected meaning. "Does your shoulder feel more comfortable now?" Claire asked after finishing. He slowly tested the movement before nodding once. "It does." She smiled with quiet satisfaction. "Then we have made good progress already." Before leaving, Claire placed a cup of warm herbal tea beside the bed. "I will return later this afternoon to check on you again." The stranger looked at her with an expression that seemed equal parts gratitude and surprise. "You intend to come back?" Claire laughed softly. "Of course. Every patient deserves proper care." As she closed the door behind her, she never noticed several senior healers standing motionless at the opposite end of the corridor, staring toward the room with expressions of complete disbelief, because they had spent weeks making certain no inexperienced healer would accidentally enter that very room, and yet on her first morning, the newest Omega healer had calmly treated the one patient everyone else had quietly learned to avoid. Claire Bennett spent the remainder of her first morning moving from one patient to another with the same steady kindness she had shown inside the quiet room at the end of the hallway. She prepared herbal tea for an elderly gardener recovering from exhaustion, changed fresh bandages for a young carpenter with an injured wrist, and comforted a frightened child who worried more about missing home than about feeling ill. Yet despite the busy rhythm of the Royal Infirmary, her thoughts occasionally returned to the mysterious patient with calm silver eyes. There had been something unusual about his quiet confidence, something that did not match the loneliness surrounding his room. Shortly after noon, she prepared a fresh mixture of mountain herbs, warm broth, and clean linen before walking back toward the silent corridor. This time, she noticed several experienced healers exchanging nervous glances as she approached the final door. One of them opened his mouth as though intending to stop her, but another gently placed a hand upon his shoulder. Neither said a word. Claire smiled politely before knocking once again. "May I come in?" she asked. "You may," the calm voice answered from within. She stepped inside carrying the tray and immediately noticed that the breakfast she had encouraged him to eat had disappeared. "That is encouraging," she said warmly, while placing the fresh supplies beside the bed. "A good appetite usually means the body is recovering." The patient looked toward the window where sunlight filtered across the wooden floor. "Perhaps your confidence is more effective than the medicine." Claire laughed softly while checking the clean bandages she had applied earlier that morning. The herbs deserve most of the credit. She carefully replaced the dressing once more, her movements gentle and practiced. "Does it still ache when you move?" The stranger slowly rotated his shoulder before answering. "Far less than yesterday." Claire smiled with quiet satisfaction. "Then tomorrow should be even better." As she prepared another cup of herbal tea, the man watched her thoughtfully. "You never asked my name." Claire stirred the steaming drink before handing it to him. "If you wish to tell me, I will gladly remember it. If you prefer silence, I will still care for you the same way." He accepted the cup with genuine appreciation. "Most people believe names are important." Claire nodded gently. "They are. But healing comes first." The stranger remained quiet for several moments before saying, "My friends call me Adrian." Claire smiled naturally. "Then I am pleased to meet you properly, Adrian." She introduced herself again, this time with a comfortable familiarity shared between healer and patient rather than strangers. They spoke quietly about ordinary things that afternoon. Adrian asked whether she enjoyed working inside the infirmary. Claire admitted she had dreamed of becoming a healer since childhood because helping frightened people had always seemed more meaningful than seeking recognition. Adrian listened carefully to every word. "Do you never become discouraged?" he asked. Claire looked around the peaceful room before answering. "Some people recover quickly. Others take longer. But kindness should never depend on how difficult the journey becomes." Adrian lowered his eyes thoughtfully, repeating her words almost to himself. Kindness should never depend on difficulty. Before leaving, Claire straightened the blanket across the foot of the bed and opened the window slightly so fresh spring air could drift inside. "Rest well," she said. "I will see you tomorrow morning." Adrian watched the door close behind her with a quiet smile that lingered long after her footsteps disappeared into the corridor. Outside the room, the senior healers gathered around Claire with expressions filled not with anger, but with astonishment. Their chief physician looked toward the closed wooden door before turning back to the young Omega. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "there is something about that patient you deserve to know." Claire Bennett looked at the chief physician with polite curiosity, expecting to hear that the mysterious patient required a rare medicine or special treatment. Instead, the older healer carefully lowered his voice. "Most of the staff avoid that room unless they are specifically requested." Claire blinked in confusion. "Has he been difficult?" The chief physician slowly shook his head. "No. That is not the reason." Before he could continue, another assistant hurried into the hallway carrying a basket of fresh herbs, asking for help with newly admitted patients. The brief interruptions scattered the gathered healers in different directions. The chief physician sighed apologetically. "We will speak later. For now, continue your duties." Claire nodded and returned to work, though the unfinished conversation lingered in her thoughts throughout the afternoon. The following morning, she prepared a fresh bundle of lavender, mountain willow leaves, and warm herbal broth before walking once again toward the quiet room at the end of the corridor. This time the hallway seemed even more unusual. Conversations stopped as she passed. Several experienced healers exchanged uncertain glances before silently stepping aside to let her continue. Claire gently knocked before entering. Adrian looked noticeably stronger than the day before. Morning sunlight streamed through the narrow window, casting soft golden light across the neatly arranged room. The untouched silence that had filled the chamber during her first visit had gradually been replaced by quiet familiarity. "Good morning," Claire said with a warm smile. "You look much better today." Adrian smiled gently. "I believe your prediction was correct." She checked his pulse, examined the healing bandages, and carefully prepared a fresh dressing with calm confidence. "Your recovery is progressing exactly as I hoped." Adrian watched her work before asking, "Does nothing about this room make you uncomfortable?" Claire looked around thoughtfully. "It is quieter than the others." He smiled faintly. "Only quieter?" She laughed softly. "I have learned that every patient carries a different story. Some simply need more silence than others." Adrian rested comfortably against the pillow. "And you never wonder why no one else visits?" Claire paused only long enough to tighten the final fold of the clean bandage. "If you wish to tell me, I would. Listen, if you do not, I will still return tomorrow." The answer seemed to surprise him once again. "You make very few assumptions." Claire placed the used linens into her satchel before replying. "Assumptions can make people invisible. A healer should notice the person before noticing the rumors." Adrian lowered his eyes, quietly repeating those words to himself. After finishing her work, Claire poured warm herbal tea into a simple ceramic cup and placed it beside him. Before leaving, she noticed a small silver emblem resting upon the bedside table, partly hidden beneath a folded cloth. It displayed the outline of a wolf surrounded by intricate craftsmanship unlike anything she had ever seen. "That is beautifully made," she remarked casually. Adrian glanced toward the emblem before calmly covering it again. "It belonged to someone important." Claire smiled kindly. "Then I hope it reminds you that someone is waiting for your full recovery." Adrian looked at her with quiet gratitude. "Perhaps it already does." As Claire stepped into the hallway, she found several senior healers waiting once more. Their expressions were no longer filled with simple surprise, but with growing disbelief. One of them spoke almost in a whisper. He smiled again. Another nodded slowly. "He has not done that since arriving." Claire looked from one face to another without understanding why such an ordinary conversation seemed so extraordinary. She believed she had simply cared for another patient who deserved compassion. None of them had the courage to explain that the man inside the final room had refused almost every visitor for weeks, yet somehow the newest Omega healer had reached the one heart everyone else believed could no longer be touched. The peaceful rhythm of the Royal Infirmary continued for several more days, and with each passing morning Claire Bennett noticed the remarkable progress Adrian made. The stiffness in his shoulder had nearly disappeared, his appetite had returned, and the quiet exhaustion that had once lingered behind his silver eyes had gradually given way to calm strength. Every visit followed the same gentle routine. Claire prepared fresh herbal medicine, replaced clean bandages, opened the window to let the spring breeze drift through the room, and stayed long enough to ensure that her patient felt heard as well as healed. Their conversations became easier with every passing day. Adrian asked about the small village where Claire had grown up, and she described quiet mornings filled with birdsong, neighbors who shared bread without being asked, and evenings spent learning herbal remedies from her grandmother. In return, Adrian spoke carefully about responsibility, difficult decisions, and the loneliness that often followed those who carried great burdens, though he never explained exactly what responsibilities he meant. Claire simply assumed he had once served someone important. She never pressed for details because she believed trust should never be forced. One bright afternoon, she entered the familiar room carrying fresh wildflowers gathered from the palace gardens. She placed them beside the window before smiling. "Every room feels better with a little color." Adrian looked at the flowers with genuine appreciation. "You improve every place you enter." Claire laughed softly while preparing another cup of herbal tea. "The flowers deserve the credit today." As she carefully checked the final bandage, she noticed the wound had almost completely healed. "I believe tomorrow you will no longer need this dressing." Adrian gently tested the movement of his shoulder before nodding. "Then your work here is nearly finished." For reasons she could not explain, The thought left Claire unexpectedly quiet. She had become accustomed to beginning each morning inside the peaceful room at the end of the hallway. "I suppose another healer will soon have the privilege of annoying you with too many herbal teas," she joked. Adrian smiled warmly. "I doubt anyone else would prepare them the same way." Before she could answer, a respectful knock sounded at the door. A distinguished gentleman dressed in an elegant dark coat entered carrying several neatly folded garments unlike anything Claire had seen inside the infirmary. He immediately inclined his head toward Adrian with unmistakable respect. "Everything has been prepared," he said. Calmly, Adrian acknowledged him with a slight nod before the visitor quietly withdrew without another word. Claire looked curiously toward the folded clothing resting on the nearby chair. The fine tailoring, silver embroidery, and remarkable craftsmanship suggested they belonged to someone of extraordinary importance. Adrian noticed her expression. "It seems my time here is coming to an end." Claire smiled kindly despite the unexpected sadness she felt. "Then I am very happy you recovered." Adrian stood slowly beside the bed, his movements steady and confident for the first time since she had met him. "That is because you never treated me as someone to be feared." Claire looked puzzled. "Should I have?" He paused before answering with quiet sincerity. "Many people believed they should." She gently shook her head. "I only saw someone who needed care." Adrian looked at her with deep gratitude, as though committing that simple sentence to memory forever. The following morning, Claire carried fresh herbs toward the familiar hallway expecting another ordinary visit, but when she opened the wooden door, she stopped in complete surprise. The room had been carefully cleaned. The bed was neatly made. Every medicine bottle had disappeared. Sunlight streamed across an empty floor where no patient remained. Resting alone upon the bedside table was the same beautifully crafted silver wolf emblem she had admired days earlier. Claire carefully lifted it into her hands, believing Adrian must have accidentally forgotten something precious, never imagining that within only a few days the forgotten emblem would become the key to a truth capable of changing her entire life. Claire Bennett carefully carried the silver wolf emblem to the office of the chief physician, believing it had simply been forgotten during Adrian's unexpected departure. The elderly healer looked at the emblem for only a brief moment before gently closing the office door behind them. His expression was thoughtful rather than surprised, as though he had been expecting this conversation for some time. "He intended for you to keep it," he said quietly. Claire looked down at the finely crafted silver piece resting in her hands. "That cannot be right. It must belong to him." The chief physician smiled kindly. "It does, which is exactly why he left it behind." Before Claire could ask another question, a respectful knock sounded at the office door. A palace messenger entered carrying an elegant parchment sealed with dark blue wax impressed by a magnificent silver wolf crest identical to the emblem resting in Claire's hands. The messenger bowed deeply. "Miss Claire Bennett?" She nodded politely. "By order of His Majesty, you are respectfully summoned to Blackwood Keep as an honored guest tomorrow morning." Claire accepted the invitation with visible confusion. "His Majesty?" The messenger inclined his head. "The Alpha King personally requests your presence." He placed the sealed parchment upon the desk before quietly departing. The office remained silent for several long moments. Claire looked from the invitation to the silver emblem in her hand, struggling to understand how either could possibly involve her. "There has been some misunderstanding," she whispered. "I have never met the Alpha King." The chief physician looked at her with a gentle expression that suggested he knew far more than he was prepared to explain. Sometimes answers arrive only when the right moment comes. Claire carefully unfolded the invitation. The handwriting was elegant and precise, welcoming her to Blackwood Keep the following morning and requesting that she present herself before the royal court. There was no accusation, no explanation, and no reason given for the summons. Only the royal signature and instructions that a carriage would arrive at sunrise. That evening, Claire returned to her modest room inside the infirmary carrying far more questions than certainty. She placed the silver emblem beside the invitation upon the small wooden table near her bed and quietly replayed every conversation she had shared with Adrian. His calm voice, his thoughtful questions, the unusual respect shown by the distinguished visitor, and the mysterious loneliness surrounding his room suddenly seemed connected in ways she still could not fully understand. She wondered whether Adrian might somehow serve the royal household, yet even that explanation failed to answer why the Alpha King himself wished to meet an ordinary Omega healer. Before dawn the following morning, she dressed in her cleanest cream-colored healer's uniform, carefully braided her chestnut hair, and placed the silver wolf emblem inside her satchel, hoping to return it to its rightful owner. As the first golden rays of sunlight reached the palace towers, an elegant royal carriage arrived outside the infirmary exactly as promised. The chief physician accompanied her to the entrance and offered a reassuring smile. "Do not be afraid," he said warmly. "Simply be yourself. That has always been enough." Claire thanked him quietly before stepping into the waiting carriage. As it rolled through the broad stone roads leading toward the towering gates of Blackwood Keep, she looked out at the awakening kingdom with a mixture of nervous anticipation and quiet hope, completely unaware that beyond those magnificent walls, the very first patient she had ever treated inside the royal infirmary was already waiting upon a throne, and that the truth behind every unanswered question was only moments away from changing her life forever. The royal carriage passed beneath the towering gates of Blackwood Keep as Claire Bennet watched magnificent stone walls, flowering courtyards, and sparkling fountains unfold before her eyes. Everything seemed impossibly grand compared to the quiet halls of the royal infirmary. Palace attendants greeted her with warm professionalism before escorting her through wide marble corridors illuminated by colorful stained glass and decorated with elegant silver banners bearing the ancient wolf crest she had already seen upon the small emblem resting safely inside her satchel. Every step echoed softly across polished floors, making her growing uncertainty even more difficult to ignore. She reminded herself that there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps the Alpha King merely wished to thank the infirmary staff for their service. Perhaps Adrian had spoken kindly of her to someone within the palace. Every possibility seemed more believable than the strange feeling quietly growing inside her heart. At last, the attendants stopped before two enormous carved oak doors guarded by members of the royal guard. The doors slowly opened, revealing the magnificent throne hall filled with noble families, military commanders, respected advisors, senior healers, and distinguished guests gathered beneath towering stained glass windows where brilliant morning sunlight poured across polished marble. Claire hesitated before stepping inside. At the far end of the chamber, seated upon the royal throne beneath the great silver wolf crest, sat a familiar figure wearing an elegant black royal coat embroidered with intricate silver patterns. His posture was calm, confident, and unmistakably dignified. Claire felt her breath catch as he slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers. Those calm silver eyes were exactly the same ones that had quietly thanked her for herbal tea, listened to her stories, and smiled during every peaceful morning inside the infirmary. Adrian. The realization arrived all at once. The patient she had treated without hesitation was the Alpha King himself. Adrian Hawthorne rose gracefully from the throne before any formal announcement could begin. Every conversation inside the hall faded into complete silence as the Alpha King descended the broad marble steps and walked directly toward the young Omega healer. Claire instinctively lowered her head in respect. "Your Majesty," she whispered, still struggling to reconcile the gentle patient she remembered with the powerful ruler standing before her. Adrian smiled with the same warmth she had known inside the quiet infirmary room. "It is good to see you again, Claire." She looked up in disbelief. You were my patient." He nodded gently. "I was." Claire searched his expression for any sign that she had somehow misunderstood everything, but she found only honesty and quiet gratitude. "Why did no one tell me?" she asked softly. Adrian glanced toward the assembled court before answering. "Because I wished to be treated as a patient instead of a king." Claire slowly reached into her satchel and removed the silver wolf emblem she had carefully protected since finding the empty room. "I believed you forgot this," she said. Adrian looked at the emblem before gently closing her hand around it once again. "It was never forgotten." His voice carried calm sincerity. I left it with the one person who never once asked whether my title made me worthy of compassion. Around them, the gathered nobles exchanged astonished glances, while the senior healers quietly smiled with relief. Claire remained speechless as every unanswered question from the past several days finally came together. The silent room at the end of the hallway, the respectful visitor, the unfinished explanations, and the mysterious royal summons all pointed toward this single moment. Adrian looked across the throne hall before returning his attention to Claire with unmistakable appreciation. "Today," he said warmly, "the kingdom will hear the story of the healer who reminded its king what true compassion looks like." Claire Bennett remained standing before the throne with the silver wolf emblem resting gently in her hands, while the vast royal hall fell into complete silence. Nobles, advisors, commanders, and respected healers waited with quiet anticipation as Adrian Hawthorne slowly turned to face the assembled court. The calm warmth that Claire had known inside the peaceful infirmary room remained unchanged despite the royal crown now resting upon his head. He raised one hand, and every whispered conversation disappeared. "Several weeks ago," Adrian began in a steady voice that carried throughout the magnificent chamber, "I chose to recover inside the royal infirmary without revealing my identity. I wished to discover whether compassion within my kingdom depended upon titles or simply upon need." His words settled over the gathering like gentle rain. Most people believed they were protecting me by limiting visitors. Others assumed the unknown patient at the end of the hallway should simply be left alone. I do not question their intentions. However, one healer entered that room without fear, without curiosity about rank, and without expecting recognition. Adrian turned toward Claire with unmistakable gratitude. Claire Bennett introduced herself before asking my name. She treated me before asking about my station. She listened before making assumptions. She reminded me that the finest healer first sees a person, not a position. Quiet admiration spread across the hall. The chief physician lowered his head respectfully, while many of the senior healers smiled with visible pride. Several nobles exchanged thoughtful glances as they realized the Alpha King had been speaking about the young Omega standing quietly beside him. Adrian continued. Every morning she brought fresh herbs, clean bandages, warm tea, and encouraging words. She never once attempted to discover whether serving me might benefit her future. She simply believed that every patient deserved dignity. Claire felt warmth rise to her cheeks. She had never imagined that ordinary conversations shared beside a quiet window would one day be repeated before the entire kingdom. Adrian looked across the court once more. There were moments when I deliberately questioned her judgment. I wondered whether she might eventually allow rumors to influence her heart. Instead, she answered with the same simple conviction every time. Healing comes before questions. Assumptions make people invisible. Kindness should never depend upon difficulty. Those familiar words echoed softly through the chamber, and many listeners quietly reflected upon them. Adrian descended the final marble step until he stood beside Claire once again. The strength of a kingdom is not measured only by armies, castles, or wealth. It is measured by the compassion shown when no reward is expected. He gently accepted the silver wolf emblem from Claire before placing it back into her hands. Please keep this. Let it remind every future healer that genuine honor begins with humility. Claire looked at the emblem before raising her eyes toward the Alpha King. Your Majesty, I only did what any healer should do. Adrian smiled warmly. Perhaps. Yet, you are the one who actually did it. A gentle murmur of agreement spread throughout the hall as respected physicians, palace officials, and noble families nodded with sincere admiration. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Keep, Claire no longer felt overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding her. She understood that this gathering had never been intended to celebrate a single healer. It was meant to remind an entire kingdom that compassion shown without expectation possesses the quiet power to change hearts, inspire leaders, and shape the future long after every wound has healed. The royal court remained silent for several moments after Adrian Hawthorne finished speaking, as though every person inside the magnificent hall wished to remember his words before the moment slipped away. Sunlight streamed through towering stained glass windows, filling the chamber with warm colors that reflected across polished marble floors and silver banners. Claire Bennett stood quietly beside the Alpha King, still holding the small silver wolf emblem with gentle disbelief. She had arrived expecting an explanation and perhaps an opportunity to return a forgotten keepsake. Instead, she had become the center of a lesson that would soon reshape the kingdom itself. Adrian slowly turned toward the council of advisors gathered beside the throne. Today, he announced with calm authority, the royal infirmary begins a new chapter. Every advisor listened with complete attention. From this day forward, every healer serving the kingdom will receive the same instruction before entering the infirmary. They will first learn that every patient deserves equal dignity regardless of appearance, title, family, or reputation. No room will ever again become a place people quietly avoid because of assumptions or fear. The chief physician respectfully stepped forward and placed his hand over his heart. Your Majesty, the Royal Infirmary will proudly uphold that standard. Adrian smiled appreciatively before continuing. Claire Bennett has reminded us that compassion is strongest when it asks nothing in return. Therefore, I appoint her as senior mentor for all newly arriving Omega healers. Her knowledge, patience, and example will guide future generations long after this day has passed. The announcement filled the hall with sincere applause rather than loud celebration. Claire looked genuinely surprised. Your Majesty, she said softly, there are healers here with far more experience than I possess. Adrian answered with the same gentle smile she remembered from the quiet room at the end of the hallway. Experience teaches skill. Character teaches wisdom. A kingdom needs both. Several senior healers nodded with warm approval. The chief physician smiled proudly toward Claire. He is correct, he said. Many of us have practiced medicine for decades, but you reminded us why we chose this calling in the first place. Claire lowered her eyes with humble gratitude. Then I will do everything I can to deserve your trust. After the formal gathering concluded, Adrian invited Claire to walk through the peaceful royal gardens before returning to the infirmary. Stone pathways wound gracefully between blooming roses, flowering trees, and elegant marble fountains where birds gathered beneath the afternoon sun. For the first time since entering the palace, the atmosphere felt wonderfully familiar rather than overwhelming. They spoke not as ruler and subject, but as two people who had once shared simple conversations over warm herbal tea. Adrian thanked her once more for treating him without prejudice. Claire smiled gently. I never imagined that kindness could reach so far. Adrian looked across the gardens where young healer apprentices were quietly observing the flowers while discussing medicinal plants. True kindness always reaches farther than the person offering it, he replied. Sometimes it changes one life. Sometimes it changes an entire kingdom. Claire watched the young apprentices with renewed hope, realizing they would begin their own journeys beneath principles shaped by simple compassion instead of fear. In that peaceful moment, she understood that healing had never been limited to herbs, medicine, or careful bandages alone. The greatest healing often began when someone chose to see another person with understanding before judgment, and because of one quiet decision made inside a forgotten room at the end of a silent hallway, countless future patients would now be welcomed with that same enduring spirit of kindness. Several months passed, and the Royal Infirmary became a place unlike any other in the kingdom. The long hallway that had once ended in a forgotten room now welcomed every patient with warmth instead of uncertainty. Fresh flowers rested upon each windowsill, sunlight filled rooms that had once remained closed, and young Omega healers began every morning by repeating a simple promise taught by Claire Bennett. They pledged to see every patient as a person before seeing anything else. The word soon spread beyond the infirmary into villages, military outposts, and healing houses throughout the kingdom, quietly shaping a new generation of compassionate healers. Claire never sought recognition for the change. She continued preparing herbal medicine, changing bandages, comforting frightened children, and listening patiently to elderly patients whose greatest need was often a familiar conversation rather than another remedy. Although she now carried the responsibilities of senior mentor, she insisted upon sharing ordinary duties beside every apprentice, believing leadership should always be demonstrated through example instead of authority alone. One peaceful autumn afternoon, the familiar sound of carriage wheels echoed across the stone courtyard outside the infirmary. Several apprentices glanced toward the entrance with quiet curiosity as a distinguished visitor stepped down wearing a simple dark traveling coat rather than royal robes. Adrian Hawthorne smiled as he entered the building without ceremony, greeting every healer with the same warmth Claire remembered from their earliest conversations. Many patients recognized him immediately and respectfully bowed, yet Adrian gently encouraged everyone to remain comfortable. "Today," he said with an easy smile, "I have come as a visitor, not as your king." Claire emerged from one of the treatment rooms carrying a basket of fresh herbs before stopping in pleasant surprise. "You remembered your follow-up visit," she said with gentle humor. Adrian laughed softly. A good patient follows his healer's advice. Together they walked once more toward the quiet room at the end of the hallway, now transformed into a bright recovery suite filled with flowers, comfortable chairs, and wide open windows overlooking the palace gardens. Claire paused at the doorway before, smiling thoughtfully. It is difficult to believe how different this room feels now. Adrian looked around the peaceful chamber before answering. Rooms do not truly change because of stone walls or new furniture. They change because people choose different hearts. Claire nodded quietly, understanding exactly what he meant. She reached into a nearby cabinet and removed the silver wolf emblem that still remained carefully protected. Adrian looked at it before gently shaking his head. "It belongs with you." Claire smiled. "Then it will always remind me that every patient carries a story waiting to be understood." Outside the open window, young healer apprentices patiently cared for newly arrived travelers while offering the same kindness Claire had once shown to a quiet stranger resting alone behind a closed door. Adrian watched them with quiet satisfaction before turning back toward Claire. "The greatest gift you gave me was never medicine," he said. "You reminded me that compassion cannot be commanded by a crown. It must be chosen by the heart." Claire looked toward the busy infirmary where laughter, gentle voices, and hopeful smiles now filled every corridor. "Perhaps that is why healing never truly ends," she replied softly. As the afternoon sunlight filled the peaceful room, the Alpha King and the Omega Healer stood together in comfortable silence, knowing that the quiet decision made by one compassionate healer on her very first morning had become a lasting legacy that would continue healing countless lives for generations to come.